Well, what happened in Havana was that Raul Castro, Fidel's brother, took firm control of the entire party apparatus as well as the government. And Fidel, in an acknowledgement of his advanced years, stepped aside. And Fidel is kind of admitting that, he's too old for this game now. And maybe even his ideas are a little bit too old. Raul gave a 2.5 hour speech, which was extraordinarily long for him, to say that now is the time to make reforms. Things like allowing home ownership and car ownership and perhaps ownership of small businesses, these kinds of things. And he also criticized the party apparatus for being old, for being slow, for hanging on to a revolution that was current in 1959, but it no longer is. So it was all kind of an interesting couple of days in Havana, and in the end, Raul came out as the guy who was firmly on top.
And what does Raul say needs to happen next?
Well, it's interesting. He's talking about, and granted, he has said a few of these things in the past, but maybe with not the same seriousness of intent. But he's talking about free enterprise. He's talking about people being able to hire employees. Farmers, for example, who do exceptionally well will be given additional land, so that you are looking once again at the potentiality, anyway, of large land ownership, something that hasn't occurred since the revolution in 59 and 60. And he's talking about modernizing the Communist Party, that is, bringing up a new generation of leadership people in their say 30s, 40s, and 50s who are not bound by the ideology of the past, who might make more pragmatic decisions about Cuba's future. Because, somewhat like North Korea, it's a stagnant economy and it's not really going anywhere, especially with the U.S. trade embargo in place. The Cubans would be the first to admit that while they're proud of their government and they're proud of the Castro brothers, they would like to see a lot of those conveniences that they can see on Miami television, for example, that comes across the water. We're looking at, over time anyway, sort of an implementation of a hybrid communist free market system, something that maybe was akin to what the Russians did under Mikhail Gorbachev.
But will that require a new generation of leadership?
Well, it certainly does. Let me do some quick math here. Fidel was born August the 26th. That makes him 84. And Raul is 5 years his junior, so that would be 79. And the top two party leaders after Raul are also 80-ish. And not to be morbid, but you could lose all of these people in pretty quick succession. And they are talking about bringing up people into the Central Committee that are in their 30s, 40s, and 50s, and a couple of them were elected this week. The big picture here is that the entire party needs a makeover, and perhaps Raul sees it as his mission now over the next couple of years to make sure that gets done.
What would a democratic Cuba mean for Washington?
A democratic Cuba might be an even more complicated position. And when we're talking about a democratic Cuba, we're talking about perhaps we're going to see a transition like the Russians did, which is they'll have elections, but it'll be which of these two communists do you prefer, at least initially. But if the new generation of leadership were to push Cuba in a democratic direction, that might be a little bit more complicated for Washington than the current situation. Right now it's good guys versus bad guys. It's pretty clear cut. But in 1960 and 61, when Cuba nationalized property and all of their industry, it left a lot of American power brokers out in the cold. And just to give you some idea of what we're talking about, the Americans owned half the sugar plantations in Cuba. They owned the entire cattle industry. They owned most of the mining and oil reserves in the country. And it was a gambler's paradise in which the mafia was completely intertwined. And then there are tens of thousands of Cubans who fled the islands when their homes and properties were seized, who are now living in South Florida. And all of these people are demanding compensation, and there's never been a penny paid to any of them. So if you have a democratic Cuba, who's paying them? The country's as poor as a church mouse. Does that mean that the United States government will have to come forward to make these payments? It's a very complicated picture. A democratic Cuba, in the end, presents a far more complicated picture than the one that we have today.